Hello, welcome to the EPG Pathshala program in Linguistics. I am Pramod Pandey, Professor of Linguistics at the Center for Linguistics, Jawaharlal Nehru University. The topic of discussion today is formal and functional approaches in the study of language. This topic is of great interest for students who would like to know what kind of approach, what kind of theory can be used for what kind of problems in language studies. Often we are not very clear about what theory to use, and it seems that sometimes we are lost in the absence of a knowledge of the correlation between linguistic theory and linguistic problems. The terms formal and functional, these terms are used in many senses, but three of them are the most prominent. Number one, the nature of linguistic knowledge. Number two, the goals of linguistic analysis. And number three, types of linguistic explanation. Apart from these, there are many other aspects of the differences between the two approaches, as we will see later. The terms formal and functional linguistics apply mainly to theories such as generative grammar, which is a predominantly formal theory of language, to systemic functional grammar or to sociolinguistics, which are predominantly functional in nature. We have good studies discussing the differences and the similarities between these two approaches to language. One of the best known is Frederick Neumayer's 1998 book. Apart from these, the literature is replete with the discussion of the relation between formal and functional theories. In the Learn More file of the present module, you will notice the large number of references given there. You should be able to find your way through them. Now, the terms, the various points of difference between formal and functional, in order to be able to get a full idea about what we mean by formal and functional. It should be kept in mind that the distinction is not absolute. So we don't have from the start theories which are formal or theories which are functional. It's in the way these theories have developed and the ways they have selected data for analysis and the kinds of methods of research that have been employed and the nature of explanation that is found to be given importance in these theories, that we are able to be fairly just in trying to distinguish between these two approaches, formal and functional. Sometimes the difference is considered to be so sharp that we have some knowledge about the linguists working in one theory not being tolerant of linguists working in the other theory, and both it's mutual. So sociolinguists have not much place for, let's say, generative grammar, and generative grammar has not much place for something like systemic functional grammar. The two function differently with their own different emphases and concerns. To begin with, you take a look at the topics given there, on the basis of which we can say that formal and functional approaches differ from each other. To begin with, the theoretical goals. In formal approaches, the main theoretical goal is to account for the knowledge of language. Chomsky made a distinction between competence and performance. It's not the utterances which you hear and the text that you see written that has to be accounted for. Rather, it's the knowledge underlying these utterances, the knowledge underlying the text, written text. That is the goal of the study of formal approaches. For example, in generative grammar, take a look at the sentences in 2 and 3. The sentences in 2, for example, are fairly similar in structure. The cycle was found by the police. The cycle was found by the road. And the third set, the police found the cycle was found by the police. If you look at the sentences in 2, how do you think the speakers of English understand them? Do they understand them as identical in meaning? So the cycle was found by the police. So it's the police which found the cycle. The cycle was found by the road. Is it the road which found the cycle? You will say no. How is it that the two have come about to have the same structure? There are processes which have applied in language. These processes are not available to you for seeing, but we assume that there are these these processes are abstract in nature, and the job of linguists is to explicate them, bring them out to be able to explain linguistic knowledge. The third set of sentences is quite the opposite of the second set. Here what we have are two sentences which are quite different in their surface structure. The police found the cycle and the cycle was found by the police. In one case, what comes at the end is what comes in the beginning, etc. But if you ask the native speaker, how does he, she understand these two sentences, you will find that there is hardly any difference in the way these two sentences are understood. They are seen by most speakers and hearers of the language as related and as having more or less the same meaning. So the active and passive sentences, the job of the formal linguist is to try and to account for these surface differences. If the two sentences are understood in the same way, then there must be some way of showing that they are somewhere identical in structure. Now, to sum up, the theoretical goal of generative linguistics or formal linguistics in general is to account for the competence of language, the knowledge that the speaker, hearer has of the sentences of his language, and not performance, that is, the actual utterances and the written text. So now, what about the functional approaches? What are the goals of the functional theories of language? Essentially, we can sum all these goals up as a sort of concern with the use of language in different contexts. So, social linguists like Delheims and Labov and others have questioned the use of linguistic competence alone as the goal of linguistic study. Himes used the term communicative competence, which has come to gain considerable currency. What Himes is talking about is not just the linguistic knowledge, but also the knowledge of the social context, that is how these structures come to be used in society by the speakers. So the basic difference between the two theories seems to be linguistic competence versus communicative competence. These differences, I will repeat and will repeat several times over, are not absolute. The second point of difference between formal and functional theories of language is the nature of linguistic knowledge assumed by them. The nature of linguistic knowledge assumed by the formal theories of language is that which is found common amongst all languages. The term that has been used is universal grammar. It is the biologically endowed faculty of language that all human beings share. That is the goal of studying in formal linguistics. What is the nature of this knowledge? How does it come about? How does it grow, etc.? Another term that is very useful in distinguishing formal from functional theories is the computational ability versus the adaptive ability. So formal theories are more concerned with the computational abilities, the given abilities to compute linguistic structures, linguistic units. The functional theories of language, on the other hand, are concerned with issues such as how do languages vary, how do speakers communicate with each other, given the knowledge of language, how do speakers use it in different ways, in different contexts. So essentially, this can be summed up as the adaptive faculty of language. So the two approaches to this study of language on the basis of their emphasis on the nature of knowledge can be said to be computational faculty versus adaptive faculty as their goals of investigation. And the functional theories are known to use the methods of social science. What do you mean by the methods of natural science? In natural science, as we all know, you begin with the hypothesis formulation, you test hypothesis, you choose between analysis, you find support and evidence in favor of one analysis over the other, and then you state your generalizations in such a way that they are verifiable and refutable in the sense of Karl Popper, who insisted on scientific statements to be refutable. You should be able to state them in such a fashion that it is possible for the reader or for the hearer to go and verify. For example, in the classroom, if you say there are 34 students, you can verify it. But if you say there are many students, it's difficult to verify it because the understanding of many differs from individual to individual. The method of research followed in functional theories is that of social science, as we said. How does social science method of research work? You are interested in the different variables that are at work in the functioning of a social issue, social problems. How do these functions, how do these variables relate to each other, and then can we quantify them? What are the statistics of the different variables, so that we come to some generalizations about the problem, the issue at hand. This essentially is what characterizes the theories known as, which can be called formal, sorry, I can repeat. Yeah. This can be said to characterize the functional theories of language. Now, in addition to these, so the next point of difference is relevant data. When formal theories take up a problem, what kind of data do they have to collect? What kind of data are relevant to their study compared to, let's say, the linguists working in the functional approach to language studies? In formal approaches, essentially, because the purpose is to account for linguistic knowledge, essentially the data that is of interest is the intuitive data of the native speaker here. So essentially, when you are trying to account for the competence of a speaker hearer, you expect that it is the speaker of a language who knows his language full or her language full, and the issue is how does he know or she know this language? What are the ways in which we can claim that this is how they know the language? Now, in order for us to be able to come to some kind of a conclusion, a generalization about the nature and structure of the knowledge of a native speaker hearer, we have to appeal to their intuition data. So people will use methods of trying to extract the intuition of the native speaker hearer. Compared to this, the functional theories are not concerned with the intuition of the speaker hearer, rather the behavior of the speaker hearer and the use of language that she or he puts. So basically then we have the data sets are of a different kind here. The formal linguistic data versus the functional linguistic data. So basically it is intuition versus use. One of the most important ways in which formal and functional theories can be said to differ is with regard to the kind of explanation that is sought in these two theories. Formal theories, as we said, use the scientific research method, that is the research method of natural science. The most important kind of explanation found in natural science is known as the DN model or the deductive nomological model. It's essentially deductive. So you begin with a hypothesis and then you try and find how the hypothesis works, and then you propose laws. That's nomology. So you begin with the generalization and then you come to propose a law which helps explain the problem that has been taken up for investigation. As compared to this, functional theories normally prefer the kind of explanation to be more statistical, or also known as teleological. Teleological simply means actually functional. So how does a phenomenon work? What are the different ways in which we can look at the phenomenon varying under different contexts? These are the methods that are used in order to be able to provide explanation in these two approaches. One of the things that needs to be mentioned here is that formal linguistics also introduced a kind of explanation that has come to be seen as a contribution to our understanding of explanation. The formal theories are said to focus on formal explanation, that is, the role of linguistic formalism. So if you are accounting for phonological knowledge, then what kind of formal devices the speakers are expected to be using. So the formal explanation is based on the use of formal devices, the symbols, the terms, notions, mathematical devices of connecting two different elements together or distinguishing them, etc. Now the formal explanation has come to stay with formal linguistics by and large, and we will see how the influence, the impact of the use of formal explanation is such that it has helped bring the two approaches come close together. The nature of argumentation is the next point of difference. The kind of argumentation which we typically find in formal approaches is based on deduction. It's deductive. For example, you propose a hypothesis and you try to provide argument, logical or empirical argument in support of it. And in order to prove your point, you go for data of a certain kind, namely negative data. So if you want to prove that this and this is the state of affairs with regard to the linguistic knowledge of a native speaker hearer, you would like to show that anything else can be disproved. So you also have negative data to show that an alternative explanation does not hold good. Compared to this, in functional linguistics, we use inductive argumentation, because what you do is to begin first with the collecting data and then analyzing data, and then come to arrive at an explanation and provide argumentation about your explanation. So the nature of argumentation is somewhat different. There is no appeal to negative data, for example, in functional approaches. Most of the data are positive data, that is the data actually used. So in spoken or written text, we don't go for data which is not available, compared to the argumentation in formal approaches, where the data which is not there present is also produced as evidence for the linguistic knowledge, nature of linguistic knowledge that is claimed by the theories. The theoretical terms, see, the formal theories of language are known to be able to use formal concepts and formal terms, which is defined in terms of their structure, their distribution. For example, what is a VP? Now, in generative grammar, VP is defined as VP, rewrite as V plus NP, and that's given. So it's a structure which says a VP is one where there are two elements. So we have V preceding and NP following, and so if it is an intransitive verb VP, then the NP will be optional, and you can go on to look at to consider data which also include other phrases like adjective phrase, adverb phrase, and then you make a statement with regard to the structure of a certain unit, of a certain entity. Compared to this, in functional approaches, it is essentially the function of a grammatical element, their semantic function, which is the focus of interest. So we find essentially terms used in functional approaches to language, terms such as modifier and head, a complement and head, even subject and object are essentially considered to be functional in nature. Then finally, linguistic evidence. What kind of evidence is sought in these two approaches? In formal approaches, the evidence is entirely internal. That is, whatever arguments you make in formal approaches, the arguments are essentially based on the system that you are investigating. If an explanation covers a large number of facts within the system, a larger number of facts within the system, then it's preferable to an explanation that covers a smaller number of elements in a system, data in the system. So essentially then the evidence that is sought in support of an explanation, a theoretical formulation, is said to be internal evidence, compared to the functional approaches relying on external evidence. That is, functional approaches do not hesitate in making use of data from other domains such as damage or language change, and purely even functional theories of grammar also resort to be looking at how the language is used by the native speaker hearer. So essentially, difference between internal evidence predominantly in formal approaches versus external evidence predominantly in functional approaches. Having discussed the various points of difference between formal and functional approaches, it should be noted that both the approaches also have come close to each other, and it appears that there is grounds for us to think that these two approaches are complementary rather than contending. What do we mean by complementary rather than contending? What we mean is they complement each other and not necessarily compete with each other. So it's not that you have to choose one for the other, rather you have to see which particular theory applies to which data. For example, it's been found that if your objective is to analyze the knowledge of language, then it's quite clear that you will use a formal approach. If your domain of analysis is language use, then you use a functional approach essentially. Similarly, it has been now seen that the way in which language is looked at as an object in these two theories seems to be not essentially correct. So the idea that language is a natural object and is thus investigable in terms of the methods of natural science, and the fact that language is a social object that can be investigated in terms of social sciences seems to be not very well founded, and there have been proposals for considering the language object as both natural and social. Both the aspects are involved in giving us the structure and knowledge of language. So the two must be seen as complementary rather than contending. There is also a growing rise actually in the use of context mutually in the two theories. Thus, in functional approaches, we see a rise in the interest of formalism. For example, William Labov's contribution to phonology using the variable rule mechanism. Now, essentially, the idea is to be able to explain linguistic variation, phonological variation, in terms of a formal device. Although the main concern is variation, but there is use of a formal device in trying to predict variation. Similarly, the functional notions such as object, complement, head, etc. have also been brought in, although formalized in formal linguistics. Of late, there has been a trend generally to use as much of functional concepts as is found necessary for explaining linguistic knowledge. Thus, in minimalist theory, Chomsky has a principle called last resort. That essentially is a functional term, last resort. In fact, if you look at the development of linguistic theory, you will find that there are some certain theories or sub-theories of language that seem to have evolved out of a general complementary approaches of formal and functional linguistics. An exemplar case here is distinctive feature theory. The theory started in Praha school by linguists such as Jakobson and Trubetskoy. It continued to grow there, and gradually it was taken up by generative phonology to be a part of its basic mechanism, device of characterizing linguistic sounds and of formulating phonological rules. Now, but the very notion itself, as you can see, distinctive features which distinguish, is a functional notion, and the use of the formal device of binariness of features and plus and minus voice, plus and minus sonorant, etc., is a formal device. Even later, when we find distinctive feature theory being used to explain linguistic knowledge, we find that the theory has been extended to the explanation of formal issues such as how do phonological inventories structure themselves. So when it comes to explaining the structure of phonological inventories, the use of distinctive features is considered to be crucial. Features which help distinguish sounds minimally are the ones which are preferred in grammars. So basically, although we started with the idea of these approaches to language study having been prevalent in linguistic studies, it is necessary to be aware of them, but it is also necessary to know that they actually are complementary to each other, and they should be used with full knowledge about the suitability of theory to data. For example, let's take up certain problems and see whether the theory should be predominantly formal or predominantly functional in approach. We say predominantly because, again, as we repeat, there is no absolute distinction between them. Problems which are can be investigated more easily by a predominantly functional theory are problems such as computational linguistics, machine translation, which is concerned with translating one text into another. So basically you are looking at surface structure. It's not the knowledge of the structure which is involved here at all. It's just the given surface structure, spoken or written. Speech synthesis, you're concerned with a certain output of speech or of text, and so it's not the knowledge but actual physical reality of the output of the spoken or written text. Topics such as stylistics, for example, again deal with texts, not the knowledge underlying the text but the use of text, the mechanism, devices used in conveying meaning. And it's also well known that topics such as language teaching, language pathology, language variation, discourse, these can typically be investigated by the functional approach to language, a functional theory. Topics which are predominantly suitable for formal treatments are things such as the knowledge of a language of a native speaker at any of the levels. So if you are talking about phonological knowledge, morphological knowledge, syntactic knowledge, semantic knowledge of language, then essentially you will employ formal means to account for the knowledge. With the rise in cognitive linguistics today, there are many cognitive issues such as the nature of representation of language and the language processing, such as phonological processing, syntactic processing, orthographic processing, which deal with the internal mechanism of the mind-brain. These are essentially amenable to treatment by a formal theory of language. The kind of data that are collected, the method of analysis that is used in explaining these problems is essentially formal. So you students of language should be familiar with the complementary roles of these two theories of language so that you can use the correct theory for the problems that you select for investigation. Thank you.